All right, I'm going to go ahead and finish up our lecture talking about historical approaches to management as a field. So I mentioned that after the scientific management approach, which was at the end of the 19th century, start of the 20th century, there was a lot of backlash, and this backlash showed up in terms of the human relations movement. In the human relations movement, there started to be a large focus on workers as having important and meaningful individual differences. So if you remember from Thursday's lecture, we talked about under scientific management that it was pretty innovative to start saying that there was a right employee for the job, that not everybody was interchangeable. So human relations focusing on individual differences wasn't completely revolutionary, but it was starting to think of more of the human experience. So trying to take the perspective of the individual. It started also looking at issues of motivation. Prior to the human relations movement, a lot of, if there was a discussion of motivation, it was very much a carrot and stick based approach, that our workers are inherently lazy and self-interested, and that the only way that you will get them to work is to bribe them or give them the carrots, or else threaten them or have the sticks. And so the human relations movement started to look at other more subtle types of motivation. It started to look at a phenomenon we're going to spend some time on in probably around week 5 or week 6, when we're talking about what we call internal or intrinsic motivation. What is the work that we do just for the pride or joy of doing the task, versus external motivation, when we're thinking about more transactional, I'm doing X to get Y. The human relations movement also started to look at the social aspects of work. So under the scientific management Taylor approaches, they were looking at working conditions and things like we talked about of how the physical work is structured or how tasks are performed as being important. Under human relations movement, we started to look at things like how people are being treated. So is your employer being respectful or dismissive? How does that matter at work? And also, how does your relationship with your coworkers matter? And it started to feel that rather than the social aspect being a distraction from the work, under the human relations movement, they started to realize that satisfaction and performance can both be improved by social aspects. So while not explicitly stated, it was kind of implied in earlier approaches to management, the carrot and the stick, the theory X, theory Y approach that your book talks about, that satisfaction was almost a red flag of something's wrong, that work shouldn't be fun. Human relations movement started to see that we could have meaningful, satisfying work and still perform at high levels. So under the scientific management approach, one of the names to know was again Frederick Taylor. With the human relations movement, one of the major names was the Hawthorne studies. And with the Hawthorne studies, I'm going to post a video for that, just like I will for scientific management, giving you a little background there. But it was at a GE plant in Hawthorne, some state, I can't remember off the top of my head, but Hawthorne was a location. And studies that were looking at changes in illumination, they were looking at how lights, if you increase the lighting, how did workers do? If you dim the lighting, how would workers do? So very much from a scientific management approach. But one of the counterintuitive findings they found was there was a short-term improvement after either change, turning the lights up or turning them down. And it was argued to be in part that the consideration or the interest in working conditions showed concern that people responded well to. So that's a little bit of the human relations movement. As I talked about in class, the next period was the classic period, where they were really looking at things like administrative structure. So in the classic period, they were really focused on trying to decide how to structure work administratively. So issues of bureaucracy, how many layers decisions had to go through, and what impact that would have. When we think about things like very nimble companies that are adapting very fast to change, they have a different structure than, for instance, one of the major players in the industry. If you look at for instance, Uber or any of these types of technologies that are disruptive, they often have a very flat structure where the leadership is able to just go ahead and make their decisions, that things don't go through layers and layers and layers. We can also see things like how you would empower people at lower levels in an organization's hierarchy to make decisions without having to appeal to supervisors. These were all things that fell under this classic period when we're thinking about administrative structure. We saw things like best practices where you should only have one boss, that you shouldn't report to multiple people. And that, just think about, if you parent and, when mom says one thing and dad says another thing, it's a recipe for frustration for everybody involved. Also talked about a span of control, how many direct reports you have, issues like that. It's a pretty dry structure, but very, very important work came out there. And then we can get to the contemporary or contingency approach, which, as I talked about in Thursday's class, was saying really from the late 20th century to now is where we would think of being. And this contingency or contemporary approach draws on prior work, draws on multiple fields, and it has three main premises, much like scientific management does. It's just they're different premises. The first is that behavior is complex and multiply determined. So that means nothing happens in a vacuum. When you look at a behavioral problem in the workforce, it almost never is just because you have a horrible employee. That what's going on in the situation that allows that behavior, what's going on with the manager, what's going on with the coworkers, that there are just so many moving parts, and that makes it so our answers are harder. So we could still have actions to take to improve behavior, but we have to understand that nothing's happening in a vacuum, and my actions influence your actions, and vice versa. The second draws from human relations movement, and so this premise is saying that work can be simultaneously satisfying and productive. That improving employee morale can have good payoffs. That satisfaction has benefits that managers should seek, not just to be touchy-feely, but for very practical organizational reasons. And then the third one is saying there's no single best way to manage. And again, that goes back to the complexity and the multi-determination of work. Behavior isn't just complex, we're changing constantly. So that's another issue of it. We're in a dynamic system. And so since there's no one best way to manage, that, again, it doesn't mean that there's not a best way to flip turn or to build a brick wall or anything like that. Specific tasks can have best practices. But for management, we're going to be saying that there's no cookie cutter answer that's going to be guaranteed to work in every situation. As managers, we need a toolbox of evidence-based strategies so that first, when we face a problem, we can try to assess it, figure out what's going on as best as possible, so that we pick the right tool to start with. And more importantly, if that tool doesn't work, that we can move on to the next most appropriate tool. That the strategies that work for one manager might not work for another. The strategies that work for me in one situation might not work in another. And going back to change, something that worked for me 3 years ago, if I'm teaching my classes the exact same way as 3 years ago, it might not work the same way. It might not be as effective. And so we need to be adaptive and change to our situation and those around us. So that's, again, this was part 2. We started part 1 in Thursday, January 18th lecture in class. And so this was just the conclusion there. On Blackboard, also watch, I'm going to post a couple videos, short videos talking a little bit more about these historic periods so that you get a little more depth there. So please go ahead and watch all those. Don't forget to do your quiz before week 2, and I will see you next Thursday.